The Zalari Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, an empire built on conquest and absolute supremacy. Its fleets moved through the void like storm fronts, overwhelming resistance with calculated brutality. Dozens of species had been brought to their knees, their homeworld stripped of sovereignty and their armies shattered. The Dominion had faced challenges before, but never defeat. Admiral Vorik stood at the helm of his command carrier, the HFY War, watching the swirling blues and purples of hyperspace fold away as his fleet approached its latest prize, a newly discovered system on the fringe of known space. It was uncharted, unclaimed, and filled with raw resources ripe for extraction. The perfect expansion point for the Dominion's ever-growing reach. The transition into real space was smooth, the massive carrier emerging first, followed closely by an escort of 10 warships, battleships, destroyers, and frigates, all gleaming with the sharp metallic plating of the Dominion's finest engineering. It was a hammer in the darkness, the very sight of it meant to crush any thought of defiance before it could take root. Sensors immediately began scanning the system, searching for signs of civilization. There were no planetary defenses, no orbital structures, nothing to indicate an advanced species had laid claim to this world. But there was one anomaly. A single warship drifted in high orbit over the system's most habitable planet. It was smaller than the Dominion's battleships, but not insignificant in size. Its hull was smooth and unbroken, dark and angular, lacking the modular, exposed architecture of most known warships. It had no visible insignia, no standard transmission signals, no identifying markers. It did not react to the arrival of the fleet. It simply existed, like a shadow against the planet's glow. Vorik's mandibles clicked as he studied the vessel from the bridge. It was strange, but not alarming. A lone ship, he muttered. Hardly worth noting. His second-in-command, Commander Seln, had already begun analyzing it, scrolling through scan results. No known matches in the Dominion's database. No signs of an active fleet nearby. If this is the work of an interstellar species, they are either new to spacefaring technology or foolishly overconfident. Vorik exhaled sharply. Then we teach them their place. He turned to his communications officer. Standard ultimatum. Announce our presence. Demand their surrender. If they are intelligent, they will comply. The officer nodded and initiated the transmission. Unidentified vessel. This system is now under the control of the Zalari Dominion. You will power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. Failure to comply will be considered an act of hostility, and you will be dealt with accordingly. The message was broadcast in every common galactic frequency. Silence followed. Vorik frowned. Are they ignoring us? He asked. Seln adjusted the data stream. Unknown. They are not responding, but... His voice hesitated, his mandibles tensing. They are scanning us. Vorik turned sharply. What? The ship is performing detailed scans of our fleet, Seln confirmed. Not a simple passive sweep. This is targeted. They're collecting tactical data on us. Vorik's claws tightened against the console. The arrogance of it. This insignificant vessel thought itself worthy of analyzing a Dominion battle group? Power up the fleet's weapons, Vorik ordered, voice calm but edged with rising irritation. If they do not wish to speak, then we will educate them by force. A ripple of energy spread through the Dominion fleet as plasma arrays powered up and missile bays prepared for launch. The nearest warship to the unknown vessel, a Zalari destroyer by the name of XS Braxon, moved into position to fire a warning shot. Its captain, an eager young officer looking to make a name for himself, targeted empty space just ahead of the unknown ship's bow and fired a single pulse blast, a standard display of force. It would not damage the vessel, but it would make their intentions clear. The bolt of superheated plasma tore through the void, racing toward the target at impossible speed. And then, in an instant, the unknown ship vanished. Not destroyed. Not deflected. Not even phased. It simply ceased to exist. A murmur of shock rippled across the Zalari bridge crew. Where did it go? Vorik demanded, his voice sharp. Seln's claws danced across the control panel. I don't know, Admiral. Sensors are blind. It's not cloaked. It's just... gone. Vorik turned his attention back to the viewport, scanning the void with his own eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the ship reappeared, not in its original position, but several kilometers to the right, and not aimlessly. It had repositioned itself in a perfect flanking angle against the Braxton. Seln's throat tightened. That's impossible. Vorik's blood chilled. This was not the movement of a ship retreating in fear. It was a hunter positioning itself for a kill. For the first time in decades, a flicker of unease crept through the Admiral's hardened exterior. Then the transmission came. Not garbled, not hesitant. A smooth, measured voice that carried no fear. You have made first contact, and your first mistake. The voice was not alien, not guttural or insectoid or mechanical. It was human. A species that, to the Dominion's knowledge, did not exist. Vorik's claws curled against his armrest. His fleet had arrived expecting an easy conquest, an unchallenged claim to a new system. Instead, they had walked into something else. Something that had just declared war. The bridge of the Vilecore was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the ship's systems and the distant pulsing of active scans. Every Zalari officer present had their attention locked onto the unknown warship, its dark hull reflecting minimal light as it hung against the void, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Admiral Vorik's mandibles twitched, in frustration. He had encountered defiant species before. Foolish creatures who believed their primitive fleets could stand against the Dominion. They had all fallen. Yet this was different. The way the ship moved, the way it simply vanished from sensors, bypassing their ability to track it. The way it repositioned in an instant, perfectly aligned for a flanking attack. And then there was the voice, the calm, measured tone that carried no fear. Human. It was not a name recorded in any of the Dominion's historical conquests. Not a species that had ever been mentioned in the galactic archives. And yet, there they were, standing before the most powerful fleet in this sector, without hesitation, without explanation. Vorik turned sharply to Commander Seln, who was already working to recalibrate their scans. Find me a way to lock onto that ship. I want it in my sights before it disappears again. Seln's claws danced across the console, adjusting sensor frequencies, deploying countermeasures. The Dominion's technology was unmatched. Their scanning, systems capable of tracking even the most advanced cloaking devices. But the results coming in were unsettling. Their hull is lined with something we've never seen before, Seln reported, his voice taut. It absorbs active scans. We're barely getting readings. No clear energy signature, no standard propulsion markers. It's almost like... His throat tightened. Like it's not a ship at all. Just empty space. Vorik's mandibles clenched. Nonsense. It has mass, it has presence, it exists. We saw it move. We heard it speak. Seln exhaled. Then why does every system we have say it's not there? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. The Braxton, the destroyer that had fired the warning shot, adjusted its formation. Its captain, Kelrick, was an aggressive tactician, a firm believer in the Dominion's superiority. He had no patience for riddles. Kelrick's voice cut through the fleet's comms. Enough of this posturing. If they refuse to surrender, we will eliminate them. We outnumber them, outgun them, and they refuse to even identify themselves. A moment later, the Braxton's forward batteries charged. Twin plasma lances, each designed to pierce capital ship armor, powered up with a dull hum. This was not a warning shot. This was a kill order. Destroy them, Kelrick ordered. The weapons fired. 2 beams of concentrated plasma slashed through. The void, a searing blast of energy hot enough to melt hull plating in an instant. The Zalari had crushed entire fleets with this technology. The beams hit nothing. The ship was gone. Again. Not destroyed. Not shattered. Simply... not there. Kelrick's mandibles parted in a silent snarl. He turned to his weapons officer, demanding answers. Did we miss? No, Captain, the officer stammered. They moved, just before impact, before our sensors even registered their movement. Kelrick's claws gripped the armrest of his chair. Impossible. Even the fastest strike craft cannot. A red warning flashed across his screens. Then, before he could react, the ship reappeared. This time, it was inside the Braxton's defense perimeter, a position no enemy should have been able to reach. Unnoticed, the unknown warship was now just a few hundred meters off the destroyer's port side, close enough that the hull plating of both vessels reflected against each other. It had crossed an entire battlefield in the blink of an eye. The Braxton's alarms blared. Crew members scrambled to realign weapons, redirect shielding, respond to the sudden change in positioning. All batteries! Kelrick started, and then it struck. There was no massive energy discharge, no prolonged exchange of fire. The ship fired once, just once. A single bolt of deep blue energy lanced out from its hull, not towards the Braxton's engines, not its weapons, but its very center. Kelrick had less than a second to realize what was happening. The moment the bolt touched the hull, the Braxton ceased to be. Not an explosion. Not a slow, dramatic destruction. The ship simply unraveled. Every molecule of its structure, metal, circuitry, organics, was pulled apart at a quantum level. A fracture in space itself rippled outward, swallowing the destroyer's remains into nothingness. Where the Braxton had been just a heartbeat before, there was now only an empty void. Silence fell over the fleet. On the Valkor's bridge, Vorek's claws dug into his armrest, his breathing slow and controlled, but his mind racing. An entire Dominion warship, one of their finest destroyers, had just been erased in a single shot. No debris, no wreckage, no lingering radiation. Gone. The Zalari had never seen a weapon like this. And then, the voice returned. Do you understand now? It was calm, unwavering. You are not the apex predators you believe yourselves to be. Vorek's mind burned, with questions. Who were these humans? Where had they come from? What kind of technology allowed for such absolute destruction? Yet there was no time for analysis, because the warship, the impossible, untouchable warship, was moving again. And this time, it was heading straight for the Valkor. A stillness settled over the Valkor's bridge, the kind of silence that came not from discipline or command, but from fear. The Braxton was gone. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Gone. There was no wreckage drifting through space. No lingering debris to mark its demise. Even the radiation signatures of its fusion core had been erased as if the ship had never existed. It was a form of annihilation beyond even the Dominion's worst weapons, beyond understanding. Admiral Vorek fought against the tightening of his chest. A lifetime of military campaigns had hardened him against fear, but this was something else. The warship had done something no enemy had ever done before. It had made the Zalari afraid. The crew scrambled at their stations, frantically running scans, recalibrating sensor arrays, desperately trying to explain what had just happened. Yet every reading told the same story. The Braxton was simply no longer there. And the human warship? It was coming. Moving through space with an elegance that defied physics. No thruster trails, no gravitational shifts, no electromagnetic disturbances. It was as if space itself allowed it to move without resistance, slipping between the fabric of reality like a predator through water. Vorek straightened. His mind was racing through possibilities, strategies, countermeasures. He was a soldier of the Dominion, an admiral of the most powerful armada in this sector. One ship, no matter how advanced, could not stand against the overwhelming force of the fleet. But deep down, something cold whispered inside him. Are you sure? Admiral, Commander Seln's voice trembled. The ship is accelerating. It will reach us in 70 seconds. 70 seconds. A warship of unknown origin, with impossible movement, impossible technology, and a weapon that defied reality itself, was closing in on the Dominion's command ship. Vorek's mandibles tightened. Bring all weapons to full charge. Prepare to fire everything we have. Shields to maximum density. Signal the fleet to... The lights flickered, not just on the Valkor, across the entire fleet. For an instant, all power fluctuated. Engines sputtered. Weapons flickered. Gravity plating wavered. The luminous control interfaces dimmed, and across every ship, from the smallest corvette to the largest dreadnought, A strange static rippled through the air, like a presence that did not belong. Then, a sound. Not a transmission. Not a voice. A low hum vibrating through the hulls of every ship, reverberating deep in the bones of every Zalari officer. It was not an attack. It was something older, something primordial, a warning. "Sir," Selen gasped. It's inside." "Our systems!" Vorek's claws gripped the armrest of his command throne. "What is?" Selen's mandibles twitched violently. His eyes darted across the data streams flooding his screen. "I don't know, Admiral." His voice was barely above a whisper. "But it's watching us." A cold realization settled over the bridge. The warship had never needed to disable the Braxton's defenses. It had never needed to breach the hull, never needed to board it. It had simply looked at it, and the Braxton had ceased to exist. Was that what was happening now? Had the warship turned its gaze upon the entire fleet? Vorek's mind snapped back into focus. He would not let fear cripple him. "Reroute all power to weapons and fire." His voice cracked like a whip. Now! The Vilecore's forward batteries blazed to life. Hundreds of plasma lances, neutron disruptors, and ion cannons unleashed hell. Across the fleet, thousands of turrets joined in. A storm of energy erupted from the Dominion fleet, a brilliant inferno of destructive force designed to wipe out entire planets. The void burned. The warship vanished, not destroyed, not damaged. It simply was not there. Vorek's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned sharply to Seln. "Did we hit it?" Seln stared at the data in horror. "It's behind us." Vorek's blood ran cold. He whipped his head toward the view screen. And there it was. The warship had somehow moved through the storm of fire without being touched. And now, it was positioned directly behind the Vilecore, within point-blank range. A chill ran through the bridge. The hum in the air deepened, vibrating in their skulls. Then, for the first time, the warship broadcasted directly into the Dominion systems. A single message, a voice, impossibly clear, speaking in their own language. Not a threat. Not an ultimatum. Just a question. "Why do you think you were ever in control?" Silence. Vorek felt something deep in his chest, a terrible realization creeping up his spine like ice. It had never mattered how many ships they had. It had never mattered how many weapons they fired. Because the warship was not just superior, it was beyond them. The Dominion was standing before something they had never encountered before. Something they could not defeat. Something that had decided they were no longer necessary. The warship began to glow. Not with light, not with heat, but with something deeper. A presence. The void itself began to move, and the fleet began to disappear. One by one. Admiral Vorek watched in mute horror, as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. The Dominion fleet, his fleet, was disappearing, not destroyed, not shattered by weapons of war, but erased. One by one, the battleships, cruisers, and corvettes flickered out of existence, as if they had never been there at all. The once mighty formation of 300 warships, the iron fist of the Dominion, was vanishing into the void, and the human warship, if it could even be called that, was watching. The glowing presence emanating from its hull pulsed, expanding, outward like an unseen force sweeping across the battlefield. It did not fire weapons. It did not deploy drones. It simply willed the Dominion's armada into nothingness. The Vilecore's bridge was frozen. Every officer, every commander, every battle-hardened veteran of the Dominion war machine sat locked in place, breathing too shallow, their bodies paralyzed with something far worse than fear, realization. We were never meant to win this. This was never a battle. It was a judgment. Vorek tried to move his claws, tried to issue an order, but his limbs felt heavy, as if the very concept of resistance was being crushed under the weight of the thing in front of them. "Admiral," Commander Seln's voice was thin, barely a whisper. 78 ships have already... I can't even register where they've gone. It's like they were rewritten out of time itself." The words made Vorek's mind fracture for a brief moment. Ships. Entire warships, each one a monument to the Dominion's supremacy, built with metals harvested from dying stars, powered by engines that could crack moons, equipped with weapons capable of exterminating planetary civilizations. Gone. Without a trace. Without a scream. Without even the acknowledgement that they had once existed. The human warship pulsed again. Another row of Dominion vessels flickered out of reality. 50 more warships erased. The dreadnought Krivos, the destroyer Ulan's Maw, the carriers Orok, Charn, and Vator, each crewed by thousands, each armed with devastation. Gone. A choked sound escaped from Trelvin, the Vial Corps' senior weapons officer, his mandibles trembling violently. His usual sharp, calculating expression was shattered, his eyes wide, pupils dilated to their maximum as he tried to comprehend the impossible. How is this happening? How can it do this? His voice cracked with raw disbelief. What are we fighting? Seln's gaze was fixed on his failing data streams, his fingers hovering above controls that had no meaning anymore. He didn't look up when he spoke. We aren't fighting, Trelvin. His voice was lifeless. We're being removed. A heavy silence settled over the bridge. They had faced planetary rebellions. They had crushed entire civilizations beneath the might of the Dominion's armadas. They had fought thousands of wars, had burned enemies from orbit, had rewritten the fate of entire species, and now they were the ones being erased. Admiral Vorik forced himself to breathe, forced himself to think. Panic would not save them. Understanding. Might. His claws trembled as he accessed the sensor feed, searching for anything at all, that would explain what they were witnessing. How was the warship doing this? He stared into the data, pushing past the static, past the flickering errors that danced across the screen. His mind worked frantically, scanning for patterns, energy fluctuations, radiation traces, anything resembling a weapon. And then he saw it, or rather, he felt it, because there was no trace of an energy signature, no fluctuation of exotic particles, no gravitational anomalies, no weapon, no technology, no science behind the warship's annihilation. Instead, there was something far worse, something ancient, something vast, something that did not belong in the realm of ships and metal and war. It was watching them. The warship was just the form it had taken, a shape that could be understood by lesser beings. But what lay within? It wasn't a machine. It wasn't even human. It was something else. A presence that had existed before the first stars ignited. And now, it had turned its attention to the Dominion. Vorik's body locked up as a pulse of pressure pushed against his mind. Not words. Not a voice. Just a feeling. A thought that was not his own. You thought yourselves conquerors. You were mistaken. His breath hitched. It wasn't a transmission. It wasn't being spoken. It was being placed inside him. And then, the presence focused. The Veil Corps lurched. Warning klaxons erupted across the bridge. Red lights pulsed violently. Status displays scrambled. Reality itself seemed to vibrate as if the ship's existence was suddenly uncertain. We're destabilizing, Seln shouted, his voice raw. We're being pulled. No, we're being rewritten. Outside, the warship's glow intensified. The last remnants of the Dominion's fleet, 100 remaining warships, vanished in a single breath. Gone. Only the Veil Corps remained. Vorik's vision swam. He turned his gaze to the warship, to the void beyond it. He could see it now. The thing inside the machine. The thing that had worn a human warship as its shell. It was not fighting them. It was deciding what to do with them. And in the endless abyss of that alien gaze, Vorik understood the truth. This was never a battle. This was a verdict, and the Dominion had already been sentenced. The Veil Corps drifted in the void, alone. It should not have been alone. Where once 300 warships of the Dominion's most feared armada had surrounded it, now there was only emptiness. No wreckage, no debris, no fading energy signatures to mark their passing. The warships had not been destroyed. They had been removed. Admiral Vorik stood rigid at the command dais, his claws gripping the armrest of his command throne, his pupils dilated beyond their natural limits. He stared at the place where his fleet had once existed, where his comrades, his warriors, His people had once stood as an unstoppable force. Gone. Not a single life pod remained. Not a single fragment of hull plating drifted through the abyss. There was nothing to salvage, nothing to recover, nothing to remember them by. And yet, the human warship remained. It loomed ahead, its form barely comprehensible, as if its shape refused to settle into something defined. The light it emitted was not from engines, nor weapon systems. It was something deeper, something that existed beyond the crude mechanics of war. It did not move toward the Veilcore, nor did it retreat. It simply waited. The bridge of the Dominion, Dreadnought, was silent, save for the occasional ragged breath of its officers. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time in Dominion history, there were no commands to be given. There was no battle strategy that could be executed, no counterattack that could be mounted, because there was no war to fight anymore. Not against this. Not against them. Vorex's mind trembled beneath the weight of that realization. He was a veteran of 1,000 campaigns, a warrior who had orchestrated planetary annihilations with the same detachment one might show to a minor administrative task. He had overseen the destruction of entire species, had signed the death warrants of civilizations that had dared to resist the Dominion's will, and yet, now, he stood powerless. He had always thought war was a test of strength, of dominance, of strategy. But this was not war. This was judgment, and the Dominion had been found wanting. A strangled noise escaped from Seln, the Veilcore's senior tactical officer. It was not a word, not even a whisper, just a sound, a noise of realization, of understanding, of surrender. Trelvin, the weapons officer, gripped his console so tightly that his exoskeletal fingers cracked under the pressure. His mandibles twitched erratically, his throat convulsing as he tried, and failed, to form coherent speech. All the firepower they had brought into this battle, all the glorious technology they had wielded, all the devastation they had promised, none of it had mattered, none of it had even been acknowledged. The human warship had not fought them. It had decided their fate. And now it was watching, waiting for something unseen. A single thought burned itself into Vorex's mind. Why? Why had they been spared? Why was the Veilcore allowed to remain when every other warship had been erased without hesitation? His breathing quickened. His claws twitched. He had spent his life delivering final judgments upon lesser races. He had listened to their desperate pleas for mercy, their empty promises of surrender, their frantic cries for salvation that had never come. Now, he was the one standing at the edge of annihilation. The weight of that irony was suffocating. But something deeper, something far worse clawed at his mind. The humans had never sent a message, never offered terms of surrender, never issued a demand, and that meant, they don't care about us. That thought struck harder than anything before. Not hatred, not vengeance, not retribution for the Dominion's conquests, just indifference. The human warship had not reacted to the Dominion as a foe. It had simply decided that their existence was no longer necessary. The way one might erase a mistake. Vorex's claws trembled as his eyes locked onto the warship once more. His mind screamed at him to act, to do something. But what? What was left to do when standing before something that existed outside the very laws of war and conquest? His throat felt dry. His mind was fracturing under the weight of knowledge his people were never meant to possess. And then, a pulse. The human warship shifted, not physically, not in the way traditional engines moved a vessel. It was more like the fabric of space itself rearranged to accommodate its will. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, not in language, but in understanding. The presence behind the ship reached out, not through sound, nor through transmission, but through concept. A single thought forced itself into Vorex's mind, so vast, so alien, that it almost shattered his ability to process it. You were never meant to reach this far. Vorex's breath hitched. And then, he saw, not with his eyes, but with his consciousness. Visions flooded into him, a truth buried beneath layers of history his kind had never known. The Dominion had always believed itself to be the pinnacle of civilization, a species destined to conquer and rule. But they were not. They were nothing more than an accident, a civilization that had gone beyond its intended boundaries, that had stepped into a territory never meant to be theirs. The humans had not arrived to fight them. They had arrived to correct a mistake. Vorek's body locked up as the warship's presence pressed deeper into his mind, its sheer gravity consuming everything he had ever known. And then, it whispered one last truth. Go home. The Valkor lurched violently, every system in the ship shutting down at once. For the first time in Dominion history, a war was not lost, but denied. Vorek could only watch as the human warship turned away, its form shifting, fading, and then just like that it was gone, not warped away, not propelled forward, just removed, leaving behind only silence, only emptiness. And for the first time in his life, Admiral Vorek realized the truth. The Dominion was not the predator. They had only ever been the prey. The Valkor drifted, lifeless and silent. The Dominion, Dreadnought, once the mightiest vessel in its sector, was now little more than a hulk in the void. Power flickered inconsistently through the ship's veins, emergency lights casting jagged, failing glows along the cracked bulkheads. The warship's systems had not simply shut down. They had been unmade, their intricate networks dissolved into meaninglessness. On the bridge, Admiral Vorek sat motionless in his command throne, his hands resting limply against the carved armrests. His claws, once sharp and gleaming, had dulled against the metal as he had clenched them too tightly, too often, in the moments before the event. The bridge crew lay in stunned paralysis, their bodies still alive, but their minds broken. They had all seen, not with their eyes, nor through sensor readouts or analytical displays. The knowledge had been forced upon them, imprinted into the deepest recesses of their consciousness. They had felt the presence of the human warship. They had been touched by something beyond their understanding, and now, there was no forgetting. Vorek forced himself to move. His limbs responded with agonizing slowness, as if his own body was reluctant to acknowledge that time was still progressing. He turned his gaze toward his officers, searching for any sign of movement. Tactical Officer Seln had collapsed forward, his breathing uneven, his mandibles clicking softly in unconscious distress. His hands still gripped the console, but his digits were slack. His pupils remained dilated, as if he were staring into the abyss. Weapons Master Trelvin had not moved for several minutes. His mouth was slightly open, his inner eyelids flickering, erratically, as if his mind were trapped in some unseen nightmare. The other officers were no better. Every last one of them bore the same expression. They were not afraid in the way a soldier feared death or a warrior feared failure. This was something else, something primal. Something that had no name in any Dominion language. Something that only prey could understand. A sudden shudder ran through the ship. The deck plating groaned as if the vessel itself were struggling to remain intact. The Valkor's external systems flickered, attempting to reconnect to something that was no longer there. For the first time in Dominion history, a warship had been spared. And Vorek did not know if that was a blessing or a curse. He forced himself to stand, though his limbs resisted. His vision swam, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged beast. Every instinct in his body screamed that he should flee, not just from this place, but from everything, from the Dominion itself, from the war, from the stars. But he was an admiral. He had duties, a mission, even if none of it mattered anymore. With a sharp intake of breath, he took a single step toward the communications panel. The moment he did, the silence of the bridge was broken. A voice. No, not a voice. A whisper. It did not come from the ship's intercom. It did not vibrate the air. It did not echo in the chambers of his ears. It came from within. You were warned. Vorek froze. His claws dug into the armrest of his chair, his breathing turning shallow. No. No. That wasn't possible. The human ship was gone. Gone. And yet, we did not come to fight. The voice was inside him. Inside all of them. The officers still seated at their stations twitched, their heads tilting slightly, their expressions twisting in silent agony. They were hearing it too. But you made us decide. Vorik's entire body went rigid. He was not prepared. For this, no one was. No empire, no civilization, no species could have been. Do you understand? A rush of images overwhelmed him. Not of the battle, not of the destroyed fleet, but of the truth. The humans were not what the Dominion thought they were. They were not an empire. They were not warriors seeking conquest. They were not a fledgling species clawing its way into the void. They were something else, something the universe had forgotten, something that had no place in the order of the stars. And the Dominion had made a mistake. The moment they had seen that warship, the moment they had engaged, the moment they had decided that humanity could be conquered, they had made themselves a problem to be solved. Vorik staggered, his mind buckling. Under the weight of that revelation, he tried to resist it. He tried to deny it, but he could not. "Leave this place," the voice whispered, "and never return." Then, all at once, the presence was gone. The bridge lights flickered, and for the first time since the battle's end, the ship's systems reactivated. The emergency signals ceased, and the ship's engines hummed back to life. Vorik collapsed back into his chair, his entire body trembling. His officers stirred weakly, blinking, gasping, shaking. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke. No, one could, because every single one of them had been branded, not physically, not visibly, but they knew. They had been touched by something greater than themselves, something that had decided to let them live, and they would never forget it. Vorik turned toward his helmsman, who sat motionless at his station, his fingers hovering over the controls as if terrified of making a mistake. The admiral took a slow, shuddering breath. His throat felt raw, as if the very air had turned to ashes in his lungs. "Take us home," he rasped. The words felt hollow. Home no longer meant anything, but there was no other choice. The Veilcore turned, its hull groaning as its engines engaged. It limped forward, retreating from the battlefield, from the place where an empire's pride had been broken. As the ship faded into the void, Vorik turned his gaze toward the darkness, toward the place where the human warship had once been. And, he knew, the Dominion had not merely lost a battle. It had witnessed the true rulers of the void, and from this moment onward, they would live in fear. The Veilcore continued its slow, agonizing drift through the void. Despite the best efforts of its crew, despite the flickering engines and failing systems, the ship seemed to resonate with a quiet, mournful hum, a constant reminder of the terror they had witnessed, a sound that filled the empty spaces between the stars with a tension that was almost palpable. There was no escaping it now. The battle had ended, but the fear had only just begun. Admiral Vorik sat in his chair, his mind a maelstrom of questions, none of which he could answer. His eyes were fixed on the view screen, which now displayed the vast emptiness of space, the expanse of stars and nebulae that had once felt comforting, now felt like an oppressive void, a space that had witnessed their humiliation. The cold light of distant stars filtered through the fractured hull of the Veilcore, casting eerie shadows across the bridge. As the dreadnought limped toward its home port, Vorik's thoughts drifted back to the moment when the human warship had appeared. Its sudden, impossible arrival. The eerie silence that had preceded the chaos. The Dominion had been on the verge of victory. They had calculated everything, planned for every eventuality, yet none of it mattered in the face of this new unknown. "They were nothing like we expected," Vorik muttered to himself, his voice hoarse as if the weight of his words was enough to crush him. His eyes were drawn once more to the empty space outside the view screen, his gaze lost in the endless dark. He could still feel the ripple of that moment, the chill of realization that had spread through him when the human warship had revealed its true power. He had been a seasoned commander, one who had seen the might of the Dominion's fleets obliterate entire civilizations. Yet nothing had prepared him for the relentlessness of what he had witnessed. The dreadnought's engines groaned, an eerie symphony of mechanical failure and strained effort. Even now, with the battle behind them, there was no real sense of safety. They were limping, battered, and broken, and Vorik knew that it was only a matter of time before their enemies, those who would have once cowered before them, would be emboldened. The humans had shown them something terrifying. They had no fear. Humanity had not relied on superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. No. The strength of the human warship had been in its design, its sheer ingenuity, and the relentless will of its crew. The way it had disabled the entire Dominion fleet with a single devastating strike had not been a mere fluke. It had been purposeful, calculated, and executed with a precision that Vorik could not even begin to comprehend. It had outthought them, outmaneuvered them, and, most terrifyingly of all, it had anticipated every move they had made. It was as if the humans were a step ahead, not in weapons or tactics, but in their sheer resolve. The Dominion had always prided itself on its military might, its technological superiority, its unshakable belief that it could dominate any species in its path. But that illusion had shattered in an instant, leaving nothing but the cold, suffocating grip of reality. Vorik knew that even if the Dominion had won today, the victory would have been empty. The universe had already shifted. The balance had already been tilted. The humans had won, not through brute force, but through something far more terrifying: their ability to adapt, to change the rules of the game in ways the Dominion could not even imagine. In the quiet of the bridge, the Admiral finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of experience, of history, and of a realization that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We underestimated them." His words echoed in the stillness, and for the first time since the battle began, the bridge crew stirred. They turned their eyes toward him, their faces pale, their gazes haunted. It wasn't just fear that they felt. It was dread. The realization was sinking in for all of them, slowly, as they processed the truth of what had transpired. The human warship had not simply won. It had decimated them in ways that defied understanding. And now, the Dominion was left to pick up the pieces. For a moment, Vorik considered contacting the High Command, reporting the outcome of the battle, explaining the total collapse of the fleet. But the words caught in his throat. What was there to say? How could he convey the magnitude of what had happened? How could he explain that one ship, a single human vessel, had reduced the pride of the Dominion's fleet to ashes? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft beep from the communication console. He turned his head sharply, the sudden noise cutting through the silence like a knife. One of the officers, Seln, the tactical officer, had regained some semblance of coherence. He spoke, his voice weak but steady. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel." Vorik's pulse quickened. The humans were reaching out to them. They were going to speak. His mind raced. What could they possibly want? What could they say after everything that had happened? The idea of negotiating with them, after the disaster they had wrought, seemed almost absurd. Yet here they were, extending an olive branch, or perhaps rubbing salt in the wound. Either way, Vorik knew that the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. He straightened in his chair, his spine rigid. "Open the channel." Seln complied, and the view screen flickered. The image of a human officer, calm and composed, appeared on the screen. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, his face marked by the same stoic expression the Dominion's own officers had long worn. But there was something in his eyes, a glint of certainty, of knowing exactly who held the power in this interaction. "Admiral Vorik," the human officer said, his voice measured, almost too calm. "I trust the message we left you was clear. Humanity does not seek your destruction, but we will not be made to submit." Vorik's throat constricted. He could feel the words clawing at him, pulling at the tattered remnants of his pride. This human had the audacity to speak in such a way after what had happened, after the sheer magnitude of their victory. But the human officer continued, undeterred. "This is a warning. The galaxy is vast, and the choices you make in the coming days will determine whether you continue to be a part of it or fade into obscurity." The transmission cut out, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. The vial core drifted onward, the stars outside the view screen blinking like the cold eyes of an uncaring universe. Admiral Vorik sat back in his chair, his fingers trembling as he stared at the blank screen. He could hear the voice of the human officer echoing in his mind. "You will fade into obscurity." The weight of those words hung heavily in the air, settling over the crew like a thick fog. It was no longer a question of whether the Dominion could conquer humanity. The true question now was whether the Dominion could survive what the humans would do next. The silence in the bridge stretched, each heartbeat an eternity. And in that silence, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The Veil Corps had limped into the deep reaches of Dominion space, the once proud and powerful flagship reduced to little more than a wrecked husk. The hum of its battered engines was a grim reminder of the irreversible damage inflicted on their fleet. For Admiral Vorik and the crew, there would be no glory in their return. There would be no pride to carry with them. The alien species that had once stood at the pinnacle of military supremacy had been humbled by the unlikeliest of foes: a single human warship. Days passed as the dreadnought was docked for repairs, the Dominion High Command scrambling to assess the situation. The loss of such a fleet was a blow that reverberated throughout the entire galaxy, and it was clear that the Veil Corps' fleet, now reduced to only a fraction of its former strength, was not the same force that had once instilled fear across civilizations. Even their once unshakable confidence had been shattered. Admiral Vorik, however, felt something worse than shame. It was a fear that was hard to articulate. The kind of fear that gnawed at you when you realized that the unimaginable was no longer unimaginable. The humans, with their single warship, had shown them that everything the Dominion had once believed about its place in the galaxy was false. They had witnessed the strength of a species that didn't rely on sheer numbers or overwhelming firepower, but on strategy, ingenuity, and an unyielding will to survive and prevail. The humans had made it clear in their transmission. This was only the beginning. In the days that followed, a sense of unease swept over the Dominion's leadership. The humans' warning echoed through their ranks. The galaxy is vast, and the choices you make in the coming days will determine whether you continue to be a part of it or fade into obscurity. It was not a threat that could be ignored. The Dominion was no longer the invincible power it had once been. The universe was changing, and it seemed that humanity was leading that change. Admiral Vorik, now more a shell of the proud leader he once was, knew deep down that his species would never be able to go back to the way things had been. The humans had exposed a glaring weakness in their strength, a vulnerability that could never be closed. And as he stared out into the stars from the shattered bridge of the Veil Corps, he couldn't shake the thought that his species had witnessed the birth of a new era. An era in which humanity was no longer just another species in the galaxy, but a force that could reshape it. In the distance, beyond the edges of Dominion space, the human warship remained an ever-present threat. It was a specter haunting every corner of the galaxy, a reminder of the single moment when a single ship had torn apart the very fabric of the Dominion's might. Admiral Vorik's final thoughts, as he stared out into the abyss, were a stark reminder of how far the galaxy had changed. This will not be the last time we face them. The Dominion had suffered a defeat, but humanity's victory had just begun.